The universe may not be expanding outward at all. It may be collapsing inward through us. For centuries, humanity has lifted its eyes to the sky and assumed that meaning lives somewhere beyond reach, beyond the atmosphere, beyond the Milky Way, beyond the last galaxy that our instruments can barely name. We have been trained to believe that the answers are far away, that truth hides at the edge of distance, that understanding is something we will eventually touch if we look far enough, long enough, hard enough. But what if that instinct itself is wrong? What if every time we look into the night sky, we are not observing something external, but participating in a reflection? What if the act of looking outward is only the surface movement of a much deeper process, one that bends back toward the observer, toward consciousness, toward you? Consider this carefully, without rushing to reject it, because the most unsettling ideas are rarely loud. They arrive quietly, almost politely, and only later do we realize they have rearranged the furniture of our understanding. The idea is simple, and that is precisely why it is dangerous. What if the endpoint of the universe, the place we have always imagined as a distant boundary, is not located at the far edge of space, but embedded within the structure of awareness itself? What if the universe does not terminate in darkness billions of light years away, but folds inward, layer by layer, until it reaches something intimate, internal, and strangely familiar? From a distance, the universe looks vast, cold, and indifferent. But when we map it, truly map it, we begin to notice something unsettling. The largest structures we observe do not organize themselves randomly. Galaxies cluster, filaments stretch across cosmic voids. Matter gathers into webs that resemble something else, something we have seen before. When scientists visualize the large-scale structure of the universe, they often pause not because the data is unclear, but because it is too clear. The cosmic web, with its nodes and filaments, mirrors patterns found in neural networks. The resemblance is not poetic. It is structural, mathematical, disturbingly precise. At the same time, when neuroscientists map the human brain, they encounter an inverse surprise. Billions of neurons, linked by synaptic connections, forming clusters, hubs, and pathways that resemble the universe. Two vastly different scales, two entirely different domains, and yet the same organizational logic appears in both. This is where wonder begins to harden into discomfort, because coincidence can be dismissed. But repetition across scale suggests something deeper, a rule, a principle, a template. And this is where the idea of fractals quietly enters the room. A fractal is not merely a shape, it is a behavior, a pattern that repeats itself regardless of scale. Zoom in, and the structure persists. Zoom out, and it remains recognizable. Mountains, coastlines, clouds, lightning, blood vessels, all follow fractal principles. Nature, it seems, prefers to reuse successful designs. Now imagine this principle applied not just to landscapes or biology, but to existence itself. Imagine a universe that is self-similar across scales, where the smallest structures echo the largest, where the micro and the macro are not opposites, but reflections, where inside and outside are not spatial directions, but perceptual assumptions. If that were true, then the question of where the universe ends becomes strangely misplaced, because fractals do not end in the way we expect. They do not terminate cleanly. They dissolve into detail. They turn boundaries into transitions. They replace edges with depth, which leads to a deeply unsettling possibility. The reason we cannot find the edge of the universe may not be because it is too far away, but because it is not outward at all. The reason every telescope returns more structure, more complexity, more layers, may be because the universe is not arranged like a container, but like a recursion. And in a recursive system, the endpoint is not a location. It is a state. At this point, many minds instinctively push back. This feels like metaphor, like philosophy drifting too far from measurement. But the discomfort persists because science itself keeps circling this idea without naming it outright. Physics tells us there is a smallest meaningful unit of space and time. Beyond that, our equations dissolve. Neuroscience tells us that perception is not passive, it is constructed, that the brain does not receive reality. It generates an internal model and calls it the world. Cosmology tells us that observation is not neutral, that measurement changes outcomes at fundamental levels. Each discipline independently encounters a boundary, not a physical wall, but a conceptual one. And every time we approach that boundary, the same question reappears in a new disguise. Who is doing the observing? Because no matter how far we extend our instruments, they are always extensions of perception. Telescopes are eyes with longer reach. Sensors are nerves translated into silicon. Data is meaningless until interpreted, and interpretation requires a mind. This is the conflict that modern science rarely speaks aloud. We are trying to observe the totality of the universe from within a system that cannot step outside itself. We assume that reality is something out there, waiting to be discovered, while forgetting that every discovery is filtered through cognition, through neural architecture, through patterns of expectation and meaning-making that evolve not to see the universe as it is, but to survive within a narrow slice of it. So what if the universe we are mapping is not merely external structure, but internal structure projected outward? What if the cosmic web looks like the brain, because the brain is how the universe models itself at a certain scale? This is not a claim of mysticism. It is a recognition of symmetry. If the same organizing principles operate across scales, then consciousness may not be an accident. It may be an emergent echo, a place where the universe becomes locally aware of its own structure. And that thought changes everything. Because if awareness is not something happening inside the universe, but something the universe is doing in a localized way, then the boundary between observer and observed collapses. The universe is no longer something you look at. It is something you are participating in. Here, the conflict sharpens. We have spent centuries imagining ourselves as insignificant, a pale blue dot, a fleeting accident in a vast, uncaring cosmos. That narrative is comforting in its own way. It absolves us of responsibility. It makes our inner lives feel small and disposable. But what if that story is incomplete? What if the reason consciousness feels so strange, so difficult to explain, is because it is not merely a byproduct, but a structural necessity in a fractal universe? What if awareness is how complexity folds back on itself? If that is the case, then the largest and the smallest are no longer opposites. They meet, they overlap, they mirror one another. And the place where they meet is not a coordinate in space. It is experience. If this idea intrigues you, if you feel that subtle pull of something unfamiliar but strangely coherent, then this quiet space depends on your presence. You're listening to Whispers of the Universe. If this exploration matters to you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Each small gesture helps keep this place alive and allows these questions to continue unfolding. Now, let us move deeper, because once we accept that the universe may not end out there, we are forced to confront a more unsettling implication. If the universe folds inward, then the ultimate frontier is not distance, but depth. Not how far we can see, but how deeply we can understand the mechanisms of perception itself. The brain, after all, does not perceive raw reality. It constructs a simulation. Colors do not exist as we see them. Sounds are pressure waves translated into experience. Space and time themselves may be cognitive frameworks rather than fundamental features. This means that what we call the universe may already be an interpretation, a model rendered by consciousness to navigate something even more abstract beneath. And if that is true, then the question, what is the universe, quietly transforms into a far more intimate inquiry. What is it like to be a system that can ask that question at all? The more we study the cosmos, the more it resists being reduced to an object. It behaves less like a thing and more like a process. Expansion, emergence, self-organization, feedback loops are not static features. They are verbs, and verbs require subjects. Perhaps that is why the universe feels unfinished, why every answer opens 10 more questions, why the deeper we look, the more the boundary between knowledge and self-awareness begins to blur. We expected the universe to be a place. Instead, it behaves like an activity. And if the universe is an activity, then we are not standing outside of it, pointing inward. We are inside the motion, asking questions that the motion itself has made possible, which raises a final, quiet tension. If the end point of the universe is not a distant edge, but an inward recursion, if the largest structure folds into the smallest, if observation is participation, then the question is no longer where the universe ends. The question becomes, what happens when a system becomes aware that it is looking at itself? For as long as human beings have imagined the universe, we have imagined an edge. Not because we have ever seen one, but because the mind is uncomfortable without borders. An ending gives shape to a story. A frame gives meaning to a picture. A boundary tells us where we stand. From the earliest maps of the Earth to the most advanced cosmological models, the same instinct repeats itself. There must be a last place, a final horizon, a point beyond which nothing exists or nothing matters. And yet, every time we attempt to define that point, it slips away. When ancient civilizations believed the world was flat, the edge was a cliff. Sail too far, and you would fall into nothingness. When the Earth became a sphere, the edge moved outward, dissolving into an endless surface. When we discovered the galaxy, the edge became the Milky Way. Then galaxies multiplied, and the edge became the observable universe. Then expansion entered the picture, and suddenly the edge was no longer a place, but a moving limit, defined not by distance, but by time. Even now, when we speak of the end of the universe, we do not mean a wall, we mean a horizon, a limit of visibility, a boundary imposed not by space itself, but by the speed of light in the age of the cosmos. This alone should give us pause, because a true edge is absolute, but a horizon is conditional. It depends on where you are standing, how fast you are moving, and how you are observing. Walk forward, and the horizon retreats. Build a better telescope, and it recedes again, which means the universe has never presented us with a definitive boundary, only with limits to our access. The distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. If the universe truly had an endpoint, we would expect consistency, a clear, measurable termination, a place where structure stops and nothing follows. But what we encounter instead is continuity, more galaxies, more background radiation, more fine-grained detail, more questions. Every attempt to reach the end results not in closure, but in expansion of data, of complexity, of uncertainty. This is the first quiet fracture in the idea of an outer boundary. Because a system with a true edge behaves differently from one without, edges simplify, they resolve, they allow final statements. But the universe resists finality with remarkable persistence. Even the most extreme concepts we use to describe limits the beginning of time, the smallest unit of space. The farthest observable light turn out not to be endings at all, but transitions, thresholds beyond which our current language breaks down. We call these places singularities, but that word hides more than it reveals. It suggests a point where everything stops, when in reality, it marks the point where our models stop working. The universe does not announce its end. Our equations simply fall silent. This raises a subtle but profound question. Are we failing to find the boundary because it is far away? Or because we are looking for the wrong kind of thing? To assume the universe must have an edge is to assume it behaves like an object, like a container filled with matter and energy. But containers require an outside. They imply separation, and nothing we observe suggests the universe is embedded in something larger that defines its walls. In fact, the idea of an outside the universe is conceptually incoherent. Outside relative to what? Outside implies a frame of reference that includes both inside and outside. By definition, the universe includes all frames of reference. There is nothing left over to stand in. So, when we ask, what is beyond the universe? We may be asking a question that language itself is not equipped to answer. This is where wonder begins to drift into discomfort. Because if there is no outside, then the edge cannot be spatial. And if the edge is not spatial, then what kind of boundary are we trying to locate? Perhaps the problem is not that the universe lacks an endpoint, but that its endpoint is not a place. Think of a dream. When you are dreaming, the dream world feels vast. It has landscapes, distances, movement. But it does not exist inside your skull in the way the dream appears to occupy space. The dream's boundary is not where your brain ends. It ends where the dream stops being generated. The limit of a dream is not spatial. It is structural. The dream ends when the process that sustains it changes state. This analogy is uncomfortable, but instructive. Because the universe behaves less like a container and more like a process, expansion is not something happening inside space. It is something space itself is doing. Time is not a river flowing through the universe. It is a relationship between events. Matter is not a static substance. It is energy locked into patterns. Everything fundamental is dynamic, which suggests that the universe may not end the way objects end. It may not terminate at a boundary, but transform across states. If that is the case, then asking, where does the universe end, is like asking, where does a wave end? A wave does not end at a point. It dissipates. It changes form. It transfers energy into something else. And now the conflict sharpens, because if the universe does not have a spatial endpoint, then our centuries-long effort to find one has been misdirected. We have been measuring distance, when the real boundary may lie elsewhere entirely. In structure, in information, in perception, notice how often the idea of an edge appears when human understanding reaches its limit. We speak of the edge of knowledge, the edge of reason, the edge of comprehension. These are not places in the world, they are thresholds in cognition. The universe may be no different. The end of the universe may simply be the point at which our way of knowing can no longer proceed without changing form. This would explain a strange pattern in scientific progress. Every time we push deeper into reality, the questions become less about what exists and more about how we know it exists. Physics turns philosophical. Observation turns reflexive. The observer can no longer be ignored. At quantum scales, measurement alters outcomes. At cosmological scales, observation is constrained by the observer's position in time and space. In both cases, the universe refuses to be described without reference to the act of description itself. It is as if reality is pushing back not violently, but insistently reminding us that we are not outside the system we are studying. And this is where the idea of an inward boundary begins to emerge not as speculation, but as necessity. If the universe cannot be bounded from the outside, then perhaps its limit is internal. Not in the sense of being small or hidden, but in the sense of being intrinsic to how reality organizes itself. An internal boundary does not separate existence from non-existence. It separates one mode of organization from another. In complex systems, this is common. A brain does not end at the skull in terms of function. Its influence extends through the body. A language does not end at the page. It ends where meaning dissolves. A society does not end at borders. It ends where shared norms fail. In each case, the boundary is not physical. It is relational. So what if the universe's endpoint is not a distant wall, but a relational limit defined by interaction, information, and awareness? What if the reason we keep finding structure instead of emptiness is because the universe is structured to prevent emptiness from appearing at all? This thought introduces a subtle unease. Because if the universe has no outer edge, then the only remaining direction for an endpoint is inward, toward the mechanisms that generate experience itself, toward the way reality is rendered, toward the interface between what exists and what is perceived. That interface is not located in space. It is located in systems capable of observation, which brings us uncomfortably close to the human mind, not as a privileged center of the cosmos, but as one instance of a process that may be fundamental, a process in which the universe does not merely exist, but becomes knowable to itself. If that is true, then the search for the universe's boundary is inseparable from the study of cognition. To look for the end of everything without examining the structure of perception is to ignore half the system. The universe may not be hiding its endpoint at a distance. It may be revealing it every time an observer reaches the limit of understanding. And if that is the case, then the next question is unavoidable. If boundaries are not out there in space, but arise within systems of perception, what exactly is it that we are seeing when we claim to observe the universe at all? The moment we stop asking where the universe ends, a stranger question quietly takes its place. What if the universe does not end at all, but repeats? Not repeats as a loop in time, nor as a cycle of destruction and rebirth, but as a structure that echoes itself across scale. What if the same logic that arranges stars and galaxies also arranges neurons, thoughts, and awareness, only stretched or compressed into different magnitudes? At first, this idea feels almost too elegant, too convenient. The mind is suspicious of symmetry when reality has trained us to expect chaos. And yet, again and again, nature reveals a preference for repetition, not of outcomes, but of rules. This is where the notion of fractals enters the conversation, not as decoration, but as disruption. A fractal is not a shape you look at once and understand. It is a pattern that refuses to resolve. Zoom in, and new detail emerges. Zoom out, and the same form persists. The coastline that looks jagged from space looks just as jagged under a microscope. The branching of trees mirrors the branching of rivers. Blood vessels resemble lightning. Lungs resemble coral. The logic remains constant even as the scale changes by orders of magnitude. What makes fractals unsettling is not their beauty, but their implication. They suggest that complexity does not require new instructions at every level. It only requires recursion. The same simple rules, applied again and again, generate structures that feel endlessly rich. Now imagine this principle not applied to coastlines or clouds, but to reality itself. Imagine that the universe is not built from unique architectures stacked on top of one another, but from a single deep grammar that expresses itself differently depending on scale. The smallest structures obey the same organizational tendencies as the largest ones, not because one copies the other, but because both emerge from the same underlying logic. If that were true, then the distinction we draw between the micro and the macro would be more psychological than physical, a habit of perception, not a fundamental divide. And suddenly, the resemblance between the cosmic web and the neural network stops being a curiosity. It becomes a clue. When astronomers map the distribution of galaxies across billions of light years, they do not find uniformity. They find filaments, long strands of matter stretching across vast voids. These filaments intersect at dense nodes, where galaxies cluster. Between them lie enormous regions of near emptiness. When neuroscientists map the brain, they find something eerily similar. Neurons cluster into functional hubs, Axons form long-range connections. Information flows along preferred pathways, leaving other regions comparatively quiet. The similarity is not exact, and it does not need to be. Fractals are not copies, they are echoes. This is where wonder deepens, but so does conflict. Because if the universe organizes itself fractally, then scale loses its authority. The largest structures are no longer fundamentally different from the smallest ones. They are expressions of the same tendency toward connection, differentiation, and self-organization, which leads to a deeply uncomfortable implication. If the same patterns appear in galaxies and in brains, then consciousness may not be an anomaly layered on top of the universe. It may be one of the ways the universe organizes itself when complexity reaches a certain threshold. Not special, chosen, but inevitable. This idea collides head-on with a deeply ingrained assumption that consciousness is something happening inside the universe, rather than something the universe is capable of generating as part of its own structure. We are used to thinking of minds as late arrivals, accidents of evolution, local phenomena confined to biological systems. But fractal thinking suggests a different framing. Perhaps consciousness is not an isolated flame flickering briefly in the dark, but a localized intensification of a process that exists everywhere at every scale, in every structure capable of feedback and self-reference. This does not mean that rocks think or galaxies dream in any human sense. It means that the capacity for awareness may emerge naturally wherever complexity folds back on itself. And that thought unsettles our sense of position. Because if awareness is a fractal phenomenon, then it is neither central nor peripheral. It is everywhere structure becomes sufficiently intricate. It arises not because the universe needs observers, but because observation is what complex systems eventually do. They begin to model themselves. At this point, the mind often reaches for metaphor because literal language starts to strain, and yet the scientific foundations remain stubbornly present. Complex systems theory tells us that when enough interacting parts influence one another, new properties emerge that cannot be reduced to the parts alone. Life emerges from chemistry. Mind emerges from neural activity. Meaning emerges from symbols. In each case, something genuinely new appears not by external addition, but by internal reorganization. So what if the universe itself is a complex system of the highest order? What if galaxies, stars, planets, chemistry, life, and consciousness are not separate layers stacked by chance, but successive expressions of a single recursive process unfolding across scale? If that is true, then the idea of an endpoint begins to dissolve. Because fractal systems do not end cleanly. They deepen, they branch, they turn boundaries into gradients. An edge, in such a system, would not be a place where things stop. It would be a place where description fails, where one level of explanation can no longer account for the next without changing perspective. And we encounter these failures constantly. At the smallest scales, space and time lose their classical meaning. At the largest scales, causality becomes tangled with expansion and horizons. At the level of consciousness, subjective experience resists objective measurement. In each case, the pattern is the same. Reality does not disappear. It becomes inaccessible to the current mode of understanding. This suggests that the universe may not have an outer boundary because it does not need one. Its limits may be distributed internally, wherever recursive depth exceeds our capacity to model it. Which brings us to a quiet but persistent tension. If the universe is fractal, then looking outward and looking inward may not be opposite actions. They may be two directions along the same structure, one expanding into scale, the other collapsing into detail. And somewhere in that collapse, somewhere between neurons firing and thoughts forming, the universe may be encountering itself. This does not make the human mind the center of everything. That would be a mistake of ego. But it does suggest that minds are not irrelevant. They are interfaces, places where the universe's recursive structure becomes locally explicit, where patterns not only exist, but are represented, where information not only flows, but is experienced. If that idea feels destabilizing, it should. It challenges the comfortable separation between cosmology and psychology, between physics and philosophy, between what exists and what is known, and it introduces a new kind of boundary, one that is not spatial, but structural, the boundary between pattern and awareness, between complexity and experience, between a system that merely behaves and one that knows it is behaving. If the universe repeats itself across scale, then the question of the largest thing becomes meaningless. There is always another level of organization, another zoom, another layer of recursion, which leaves us with a subtle, unsettling possibility. Perhaps the reason we have never found the edge of the universe is not because it is hidden far away, but because we are standing on it, not spatially, not physically, but cognitively. If our own awareness is one of the places where the universe's structure folds back on itself, then the boundary we keep searching for may be the boundary between unconscious process and conscious experience. And that boundary is not out there among the galaxies. It is here, now, in the act of perceiving them. So the question quietly shifts again. If the universe is fractal, repeating its structure across all scales, and if consciousness is one expression of that repetition, then what happens when a system becomes complex enough to recognize the pattern it belongs to? There is a moment quiet, almost accidental, when comparison stops feeling like metaphor and begins to feel like evidence. It happens when two images, drawn from entirely different domains, refuse to remain separate in your mind. When resemblance persists, even after skepticism has had its say. When the brain, trained to detect patterns for survival, pauses and hesitates, not because the pattern is obvious, but because it is too consistent to ignore. This is what occurs when we place side by side a map of the universe and a map of the human brain. At first glance, the comparison seems poetic, a convenient visual analogy, something pleasing to contemplate, but not to be taken too seriously. After all, one spans billions of light years. The other fits inside a skull. One is composed of galaxies and dark matter, the other of neurons and synapses. The scales are absurdly different, and yet, when researchers reduce both to their underlying structure, when color, scale, and labeling are stripped away, what remains is a shared geometry: nodes, connections, clusters, voids. In cosmology, this structure is known as the cosmic web. Galaxies are not scattered randomly through space. They trace filaments, long strands of matter shaped by gravity, stretching across vast expanses. Where filaments intersect, galaxies gather in dense clusters. Between them lie enormous voids, regions so empty they challenge our intuition about nothingness. In neuroscience, the brain reveals a similar logic. Neurons form local clusters dedicated to specific functions. Long-range connections link distant regions. Information flows preferentially along certain pathways. Other regions remain relatively quiet, forming functional voids. What unsettles researchers is not that these structures look vaguely alike. It is that they obey similar statistical rules. Both networks display scale-free organization. Both show hierarchical clustering. Both optimize for efficient communication with minimal energy expenditure. Both balance redundancy with specialization. Both exhibit resilience damage one part, and the system reroutes rather than collapses. These are not aesthetic similarities. They are signatures of self-organizing systems. And this is where wonder begins to harden into something sharper. Because if two systems so radically different in scale and substance converge on the same organizational solutions, then those solutions may not belong to either system individually. They may belong to something deeper, a set of constraints imposed by complexity itself. In other words, the universe and the brain may not resemble each other because one imitates the other. They may resemble each other because both are expressions of the same underlying logic. This idea is uncomfortable because it destabilizes hierarchy. We are accustomed to ranking things, to assuming that the larger system contains the smaller, that the macro governs the micro. But fractal systems defy that intuition. They suggest that scale is secondary to structure, that the same rules can govern both a neuron and a galaxy without privileging either, which raises an unsettling possibility. Perhaps the brain is not a small thing inside a large universe. Perhaps it is a local manifestation of a universal pattern, not a miniature copy, but a resonance. If that is the case, then studying the brain is not merely an act of biology. It is also, in a subtle sense, an act of cosmology. And studying the universe may be, unintentionally, an act of introspection. This convergence introduces a profound conflict. If the universe organizes itself like a brain, then the question, what is the universe, can no longer be separated from the question, what is cognition? I quote, "We prefer to believe that cognition is something added late, an emergent property layered atop an otherwise mindless cosmos." But network theory complicates that story. It suggests that whenever matter and energy organize themselves into sufficiently complex, interconnected systems, certain behaviors become inevitable. Information begins to circulate. Feedback loops emerge. Patterns stabilize. Models form. At some point, the system begins not only to behave, but to represent. This does not require intention. It does not require desire. It only requires enough interconnected parts influencing one another over time. And suddenly, the boundary between physical structure and mental process begins to blur. The brain does not think because it is made of special substance. It thinks because it is organized in a particular way. Its power lies not in the material of neurons, but in their arrangement, their connectivity, their dynamic interaction. If that is true, then there is nothing sacred about biology in principle. Consciousness is not locked to carbon. It is locked to structure. And the universe is nothing if not structure on the grandest scale imaginable. This is where the idea becomes unsettling rather than merely intriguing. If both the brain and the cosmic web arise from the same organizational imperatives, efficiency, connectivity, resilience, then awareness may not be an anomaly. It may be a statistical inevitability in sufficiently complex networks. Not everywhere, not always, but wherever conditions allow. This does not mean the universe is thinking in sentences or dreaming in images. That would be a projection of human experience onto something vastly different. But it does suggest that the universe may possess, at various scales, the capacity for self-reference. And self-reference is the seed of awareness. In the brain, self-reference appears when neural circuits begin to model not just the external world, but their own internal states. The brain does not merely process information, it monitors itself processing information. This recursive loop, this turning inward, is what gives rise to the feeling of experience. Now consider this carefully. The cosmic web is also recursive. Matter influences gravity, which shapes matter, which influences gravity again. Feedback loops operate across billions of years. Structures emerge, stabilize, and evolve. Information encoded in the distribution of matter and energy propagates forward in time. The universe, too, models itself through its laws, through its regularities, through the constraints that shape what can and cannot occur. Is it so unreasonable to wonder whether, at some scale, these processes begin to resemble something like awareness? Not awareness as we know it, but awareness as a property of organized complexity. This question is rarely asked directly because it makes us uneasy. It threatens the comfortable distinction between subject and object, between observer and observed, between mind and matter. We want the universe to be neutral, inert, safely separate from our inner lives. Because if the same principles that generate galaxies also generate thoughts, then the divide we rely on to make sense of ourselves begins to dissolve. And yet, science keeps nudging us in this direction. Every attempt to isolate consciousness as something fundamentally separate has failed. Every reduction of mind to mechanism has revealed new layers of organization rather than final answers. The more deeply we understand the brain, the more it resembles a universe in miniature, not because it contains galaxies, but because it obeys the same structural grammar. This is not an argument for mysticism. It is an argument for humility. It suggests that the categories we use, mind, matter, inside, outside, may be conveniences rather than truths, useful distinctions, but not fundamental ones. And this realization introduces a subtle shift in perspective. If the universe and the brain share structural DNA, then the act of observation changes meaning. Looking at the cosmos is no longer a one-way process. It is not a subject examining an object. It is one complex system interacting with another expression of itself. Universe observing the universe. This reframing destabilizes a deeply ingrained assumption that we stand apart from what we study. We do not. Our instruments are extensions of neural networks. Our theories are patterns formed within brains, shaped by cosmic history. The atoms that compose our thoughts were forged in stars. The laws we use to describe reality are the same laws that make description possible. There is no clean separation, which means the similarity between the cosmic web and the brain is not merely visual, it is ontological. It hints at a continuity between the largest scales of existence and the most intimate experiences of awareness. And that continuity raises a dangerous question. If the universe organizes itself into networks that resemble brains, and if brains are networks that produce experience, then where exactly does the universe end and experience begin? Is consciousness something that happens in the universe? Or is it something the universe does locally when conditions allow? The answer to that question carries implications far beyond cosmology. It reaches into identity, meaning, and responsibility. Because if awareness is woven into the fabric of complexity itself, then it is not an accident we can dismiss. It is a phenomenon that demands to be understood on its own terms. And understanding it may require us to abandon the comfort of external boundaries. Because once we accept that the universe and the brain are not strangers, but reflections across scale, the search for an outer edge feels increasingly misguided. The real boundary may lie somewhere else entirely, not between galaxies and voids, but between structure and experience, between a system that behaves and a system that knows it is behaving. So the question quietly sharpens once more. If the universe can organize itself into structures that resemble minds, what role does perception itself play in shaping what we call reality? The smallest things were never meant to carry the weight we placed upon them. For centuries, human intuition has insisted on a hierarchy. The large contains the small. The vast governs the minute. The cosmos towers over the particle. It feels natural. A mountain dwarfs a grain of sand. An ocean overwhelms a drop of water. Scale seems to dictate importance. And yet, modern physics tells a quieter, more unsettling story. When we peer into the deepest layers of matter past molecules, past atoms, past nuclei, we do not find simplicity. We find density, instability, rules that bend and blur. At the smallest scales, reality becomes less solid, less intuitive, less obedient to the categories that make the everyday world feel stable. Space itself begins to fragment. Time loses its smooth flow. Cause and effect hesitate. This is not because reality is breaking down. It is because our assumptions are. At scales approaching the fundamental limits of measurement, the universe does not resolve into tiny building blocks stacked neatly together. It becomes probabilistic, relational, defined not by what is, but by what can happen. And here, a strange symmetry begins to emerge. The closer we move toward the smallest meaningful units of existence, the more the universe begins to resemble the largest structures we observe not in size, but in behavior. Complexity does not diminish as we descend. It intensifies. Particles are not isolated points. They exist in fields. Fields overlap. Interactions ripple outward. Nothing stands alone. Even emptiness seethes with activity. This is where the idea that the smallest contains the largest ceases to sound poetic and begins to sound precise. Because at the smallest scales, information density explodes. A single quantum system can encode vast relational possibilities. A simple interaction can influence outcomes across space. Entanglement binds distant particles in ways that ignore classical separation. What happens here cannot be fully described without reference to what happens elsewhere. Local events are inseparable from global structure. This challenges the very idea of scale as a one-way hierarchy. We assume the small was simple and the large was complex. But what if complexity does not belong to size at all? What if it belongs to connectivity? That is true. Then the smallest elements of reality are not the foundation because they are tiny, but because they are relationally rich. They are not bricks at the bottom of a tower. They are knots in a web, and webs do not scale the way objects do. A web is defined by how its strands connect, not by how much space it occupies. Shrink it, and the pattern remains. Expand it, and the same logic persists. Remove a strand, and the tension redistributes. Cut a node, and the structure adapts. This is fractal behavior. But now it is no longer abstract. It lives at the deepest levels of existence, which leads to an unsettling realization. If the smallest scales of reality already encode global relationships, then the universe does not build itself from the bottom up in the way we imagined. It unfolds simultaneously across scales, each level reflecting and constraining the others. The bottom is not a base, it is a mirror. This becomes especially troubling when we confront the concept of limits. Physics tells us there is a smallest meaningful length, a smallest meaningful time interval. Below these thresholds, our current descriptions fail. Space and time no longer behave as continuous quantities. They lose definition. We often speak of this as a boundary, the point beyond which we cannot see. But what if it is not a boundary at all? What if it is a convergence? At that scale, distinctions collapse. Inside and outside lose relevance. Location becomes ambiguous. Events are no longer anchored to a single point. Everything begins to overlap. This is not emptiness. It is saturation. And saturation behaves differently from void. In a void, nothing happens. In saturation, everything happens at once. But meaning dissolves because differentiation fails. There are too many relationships, too many possibilities, too much information compressed into too little conceptual space. This is what makes the smallest scales feel so alien. They are not barren. They are overwhelming. And here, an unexpected parallel emerges. Human consciousness, too, has a saturation point. When sensory input overwhelms the brain, perception fragments. When too many possibilities compete, decision collapses. When thought loops too tightly, meaning dissolves into noise. At both extremes, the smallest physical scale and the most intense cognitive state structure becomes unstable, not because it disappears, but because it becomes too dense to parse. This resemblance is not trivial. It suggests that the universe's deepest layers and the mind's most extreme states share a common challenge: how to maintain coherence under extreme relational load. Which brings us back to the unsettling symmetry. If the smallest scale of the universe is not a simple endpoint, but a place where relationships become infinitely dense, then it begins to resemble something else we know well: the interior of awareness. The mind, at any moment, contains countless overlapping signals, sensations, memories, predictions, emotions, impulses, all interacting simultaneously. Conscious experience emerges not from any single signal, but from the organization of their interactions. The mind does not operate by isolating elements. It operates by integrating them, and the smallest scales of reality appear to do the same. This is where the conflict sharpens, because if the smallest and the largest both express themselves through relational density, then scale ceases to offer us an escape from involvement. We cannot retreat into the micro to find simplicity, nor flee into the macro to find objectivity. Everywhere we look, we find the same pattern: structure emerging from relationship, coherence emerging from interaction, which raises a deeply uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the reason we keep searching for a fundamental thing at the bottom of reality and failing to find it is because reality is not built from things at all. It may be built from relations, and relations do not exist independently. They require participants, they require context, they require reference. This reframes the role of the observer in a way that is difficult to ignore. If reality is relational at its deepest level, then observation is not an afterthought, it is part of the structure. Because the universe needs a human to exist, but because any system capable of describing reality is itself a participant in the web of relations that define it. This does not elevate the observer to a privileged position. It dissolves the very idea of privilege. Observer and observed become aspects of the same relational fabric, differentiated by perspective rather than substance. At the smallest scales, particles do not have definite properties until interactions occur. At the cognitive scale, experiences do not have meaning until they are integrated into a mental model. In both cases, reality is not prepackaged. It is enacted. This realization undermines a deeply comforting belief. We like to think that the universe exists fully formed, complete, and indifferent, and that we merely discover pieces of it over time. But the deeper we look, the more it appears that reality is not simply uncovered, it is participated in, not invented, not imagined, but co-shaped. This idea often provokes resistance because it feels like a threat to objectivity. But objectivity was never about detachment. It was about consistency across perspectives. And consistency does not require separation, it requires structure. If the universe is fractal, then consistency arises because the same principles operate at every scale, not because observers are irrelevant. Which brings us back to the original tension. If the smallest contains the largest, not by size but by relational depth, then the search for the universe's endpoint becomes even more misguided. There is no final layer beneath which nothing exists. There is only increasing density of relation until our current mode of understanding can no longer function. And that failure point may be telling us something crucial. The end of the universe may not be where existence stops. It may be where representation breaks, where description gives way to participation, where the universe stops being something that can be pointed at and becomes something that must be experienced from within. If that is true, then the deepest frontier of cosmology is no longer a place in space. It is a question about how systems, physical and cognitive, maintain coherence under infinite relational load. And that question does not belong only to physics. It belongs to consciousness, which leads us, quietly and inevitably, to the next uncertainty. If the smallest scales of the universe already behave like an interior dense, relational, saturated, And if consciousness emerges from similar conditions within the brain, then what exactly separates an inner world from an outer one? There is a quiet assumption woven so deeply into our thinking that we rarely notice it. We believe we are looking at the universe. That reality stands over there, fully formed and independent, while we stand here, observing it like spectators at a distant stage. The stars burn whether we notice them or not. Galaxies collide without regard for our curiosity. The universe, we tell ourselves, does not care that we exist. And yet, every single thing we know about the universe arrives through a single channel. Perception, not telescopes, not equations, not data. Perception, because telescopes extend vision, equations extend intuition, data extends memory. But all of them ultimately terminate inside a nervous system that interprets patterns and calls them real. I think this is where a subtle unease begins to form. If everything we know about the universe is filtered through perception, then perception is not a side detail. It is the final gatekeeper of reality as we experience it, and gates are not neutral. The brain does not passively record the world. It actively constructs it. Colors are not properties of light. They are interpretations. Sounds are not vibrations. They are compressions, translated into experience. Even space itself, depth, distance, continuity, is assembled from signals that arrive at different times and intensities. What you experience as a seamless world is, in truth, a constantly updated model. A simulation, not in the sense of being false, but in the sense of being mediated. This is not philosophical speculation. It is neurological fact. Remove certain regions of the brain, and the world collapses in specific ways. Faces disappear. Motion fragments. Time stretches or compresses. Meaning dissolves, while sensation remains. External world has not changed, but the universe you experience has, which leads to a deeply unsettling realization. The universe you know is not the universe as it is. It is the universe as your perceptual system is capable of rendering it. This does not mean reality is imaginary. It means reality is filtered, structured, constrained by the architecture of the observer. And once we accept this, the idea of a clean separation between inside and outside begins to erode, because what you call outside is already inside, translated into neural activity, integrated into memory, shaped by expectation, colored by emotion. The night sky you gaze upon is not a direct imprint of distant stars. It is a carefully reconstructed internal event, happening entirely within the brain. Even distance itself is an inference. Light arrives as photons striking retinal cells. The brain calculates delay, intensity, parallax, and learned patterns, then infers depth. Space is not perceived directly. It is deduced, which means the vastness of the universe, the thing that makes us feel small and separate, is already a mental construction. Accurate, perhaps. Reliable, often, but still constructed. And this introduces a conflict that is difficult to ignore. If perception shapes the universe we experience, then observation is not a one-way mirror. It is an interaction, a negotiation between what exists and what can be represented. At small scales, physics already acknowledges this. Measurement affects outcomes. Observation collapses possibilities into events. The observer cannot be cleanly removed from the experiment. At large scales, cosmology encounters a similar problem. What we observe depends on where we are in space and time. The universe looks different from different vantage points. There is no privileged position, no cosmic outside, from which everything can be seen at once. Every observation is local. Every perspective is partial. And this means that the universe we describe is always entangled with the conditions of description. This does not undermine science. It deepens it, because it forces us to confront a boundary we would rather ignore. The boundary of representation. There is a limit to how much structure any perceptual system can encode. The brain evolved to model environments relevant to survival, not to capture the totality of existence. It compresses, it abstracts, it discards information relentlessly. This is not a flaw, it is a necessity. Without compression, perception would drown in detail. Without abstraction, meaning would never emerge. But compression comes at a cost. When we peer into the deepest reaches of space or the smallest scales of matter, we push perception beyond the conditions it evolved for. We rely on instruments and mathematics to extend our reach. But interpretation still happens in brains shaped by ancient constraints. So when reality begins to feel strange, fragmented, counterintuitive, it may not be because reality is breaking down. It may be because our representational system is reaching its limit. This raises a dangerous question. What if the edge of the universe is not where space ends, but where representation fails? What if the reason the universe seems infinite, recursive, and boundaryless is because perception itself cannot close the loop? In other words, the universe may not be unfinished. Our models may be. Consider how the brain handles infinity. It doesn't. The mind cannot truly represent endlessness. It approximates, it gestures, it uses symbols like forever and beyond. But these are placeholders, not experiences. Infinity is not something we perceive. It is something we point toward when perception runs out. The same may be true of cosmological boundaries. When we say, the universe may be infinite, we are not describing a place. We are acknowledging the failure of closure. We are naming the point where our representational tools no longer deliver an answer. This is not an admission of ignorance. It is a diagnostic. It tells us where cognition stops being sufficient, and now the drift begins. If the universe's apparent lack of an edge corresponds to the limits of perception, then the search for an external boundary is misdirected. We are looking for a spatial answer to a cognitive problem. True frontier may lie not in space, but in the architecture of awareness itself. This reframes the role of consciousness in a profound way. Consciousness is not merely something happening inside the universe. It is one of the ways the universe becomes articulated, rendered, differentiated into experience. This does not imply that reality depends on human minds. Stars burned long before brains existed, but it does imply that the universe as experienced is inseparable from systems capable of experience. There is a difference between existence and appearance. And appearance is not trivial. The universe does not appear to rocks. It does not appear to empty space. It appears where there is a system capable of integrating information across time, modeling its own state, and generating a coherent point of view. Appearance is a phenomenon, and phenomena have conditions. This realization dissolves a long-standing illusion. We imagined ourselves as observers standing at a distance, peering into an indifferent cosmos. But in truth, we are embedded participants. The universe does not show itself to us from the outside. It shows itself through us, constrained by the forms perception can take. This does not make the universe smaller. It makes it more intimate. And intimacy is unsettling when we expected distance. Because intimacy implies involvement, responsibility, entanglement. If the universe's structure folds inward toward perception, then the boundary between cosmic and personal begins to blur. The same principles that shape galaxies shape neural dynamics. The same constraints that govern information flow across space govern experience within minds. The universe is not only something we observe, it is something we enact. This does not mean we create reality by wishing. It means that reality, as encountered, is always co-produced by structure and perception, law and interpretation, pattern and awareness. And once we accept this, a new kind of edge comes into view. Not an edge of space, an edge of sense-making. a place where the universe remains, but our capacity to render it into experience falters. At that edge, questions change character. They stop asking, "What is there?" and begin asking, "How is anything shown at all?" Well, this is the point where cosmology quietly turns inward, where the study of the universe becomes inseparable from the study of cognition. Because to understand the limits of the universe, we must understand the limits of the systems through which the universe is known. And that leads us to a question that is both scientific and deeply personal. If perception is the final interface between us and everything else, and if the universe appears infinite because perception cannot enclose it, then what exactly are we doing when we claim to observe reality in the first place? There is a question that lingers beneath every experiment, every observation, every carefully measured fact. Does the universe need to be observed in order to exist? At first, the answer seems obvious. Of course it does not. Stars burned for billions of years before eyes evolved to witness them. Galaxies collided long before minds emerged to record their motion. The universe does not wait for permission. And yet, when we move beyond intuition and into the foundations of physics, this certainty begins to soften. Because at the deepest levels we can currently probe, the act of observation refuses to remain a passive detail. It becomes active, participatory, entangled with outcomes in ways that challenge the idea of a fully independent reality unfolding on its own. This is not philosophy intruding on science. It is science quietly unsettling philosophy. At microscopic scales, systems do not possess definite properties until interactions occur. Possibility precedes fact. A particle does not occupy a single location until something forces the question. Measurement does not merely reveal a hidden value, it selects one from a field of potentiality. This does not mean the universe waits for a human to look at it. That would be a misunderstanding. Observation, in this context, does not require consciousness. It requires interaction. Any exchange of information that constrains possibilities counts. But this clarification leads us into deeper uncertainty, not out of it. Because if interaction is fundamental, if reality crystallizes through relationships, then the universe is not a static collection of objects. It is a network of events, constantly resolving and re-resolving itself through contact. Existence, in this sense, is not a thing, it is an activity. And activities do not stand alone. They require participants. This realization reframes the original question. It is not whether the universe exists without observers. It is whether existence itself is something that happens independently of relational processes. If nothing interacts with anything else, nothing becomes definite. No properties stabilize. No structure emerges. Reality remains suspended in a state that cannot be described as fully real or fully unreal. Interaction is what gives form. This is where the idea becomes unsettling, because interaction is not something that happens only at the edges of systems. It happens everywhere, all the time. Every particle interacts with fields. Every star interacts with gravity. Every galaxy interacts with the fabric of space-time. The universe is, at every level, in conversation with itself. And in that conversation, information flows. Information is not matter. It is not energy. It is pattern, constraint, difference that makes a difference. And wherever information flows in closed loops, something remarkable becomes possible. Self-reference. In the brain, self-reference is what allows awareness to arise. Neural circuits do not merely respond to stimuli. They monitor their own activity. They build internal models, not just of the world, but of the system doing the modeling. This recursive loop is subtle, fragile, and profoundly powerful. Without it, there is no experience, only reaction. Now consider the universe again, not as a thing, but as a process saturated with feedback loops. Gravity shaping matter, matter shaping space, expansion influencing structure. structure influencing expansion, information flowing across scales, constrained by laws that apply universally. The universe does not merely evolve forward, it folds back on itself, again and again. This is not consciousness, but it is the soil from which consciousness can grow, which leads to a dangerous tension. If awareness arises wherever information loops become sufficiently complex, then consciousness is not an exception to the universe. It is an expression of it, not everywhere, not always, but wherever conditions allow. This does not mean the universe has intentions. It does not mean it thinks in words or plans outcomes. It means that the distinction between mindless matter and thinking systems may be one of degree, not kind. And that idea unsettles us because it dissolves a comforting separation. We prefer to imagine a sharp line between the observer and the observed, between the knower and the known, because separation makes objectivity feel safe. But if observation is a form of interaction, and interaction is fundamental, then objectivity is not about detachment. It is about coherence across perspectives. Reality is not something we stand outside of. It is something we are embedded within, participating in even as we attempt to describe it. This is where conflict deepens. If the universe does not require observers to exist, but requires interaction to become structured, then the emergence of observers is not incidental. It is a natural consequence of complexity folding back on itself. Observers are not witnesses standing apart from reality. They are reality, observing locally. This reframing alters the meaning of existence in a subtle way. Existence is no longer a static condition, either on or off. It becomes a spectrum of stability, a measure of how firmly patterns are held together through interaction. At one extreme, patterns dissolve instantly. At another, they persist across vast spans of time and space. Conscious systems occupy a peculiar middle ground. They are stable enough to model reality, but fragile enough to change in response to it. And this fragility is crucial, because it allows the universe to know itself differently in different places, not uniformly, not centrally, but locally, through countless perspectives, each constrained by its own structure. This is not a cosmic mind, it is a distributed one. A universe that does not think as a whole, but thinks in fragments, through stars becoming heavy elements, through planets organizing chemistry, through life assembling memory, through minds asking questions. If that idea feels overwhelming, it should, because it suggests that the universe is not finished simply by existing. It continues to unfold through the ways it becomes knowable. And knowing is not passive. It is a transformation. Every observation selects, every interaction constrains, every act of measurement narrows possibility into fact. The universe is not merely revealed through observation, it is shaped by it, locally and temporarily. This does not grant observers power over the cosmos. It grants them responsibility within their own scale. Because if observation is participation, then what we attend to matters. What we ignore fades. What we model influences how we act, and how we act influences what patterns persist. This is not mysticism. It is systems theory applied to existence, which brings us back to the quiet unease that has been building since the beginning. If the universe is not waiting for observers, but inevitably produces them, if observation is not optional, but structural, if reality becomes articulated through interaction, then the boundary between the universe and awareness is thinner than we imagined. And that raises a question that no telescope can answer. If the universe does not need to be observed to exist, but needs interaction to become definite, then what exactly is awareness doing when it arises within that process? There is a subtle shift that occurs when the question of awareness is no longer confined to the individual. Up to this point, consciousness has appeared as something local, something that happens inside brains, bounded by skulls, tied to biology. a private theater of experience, sealed off from the rest of the universe by skin and bone. This assumption feels safe. It preserves individuality. It keeps meaning personal and contained. But once we accept that awareness emerges from interaction, recursion, and information flow, that containment begins to feel less certain. Because interaction does not stop at the edge of the body. Every nervous system is embedded in a larger network. Sensory input arrives from an environment shaped by other organisms. Language evolves socially. Knowledge accumulates across generations. Technology extends memory, perception, and influence beyond biological limits. No mind develops in isolation. Even thought itself is not purely internal. It borrows symbols from culture, metaphors from shared experience, categories refined over centuries. What feels private is often collective in origin. This realization gently unsettles the idea of consciousness as strictly individual. If awareness arises wherever information loops become sufficiently complex, then the boundary of awareness may not align neatly with the boundary of a single organism. It may spill outward, distributed across systems that exchange, store, and transform meaning together. This is where the notion of collective awareness enters the conversation, not as mysticism, but as a structural possibility. Consider how a society functions. No single person understands the entirety of a civilization, and yet, civilizations make decisions. They remember, they forget, they adapt. They develop norms, values, and narratives that persist long after individual members are gone. Information circulates through institutions, technologies, and shared symbols, shaping behavior at scale. This is not consciousness in the human sense. A society does not feel pain or joy the way an individual does, but it does exhibit properties that resemble cognition, learning, anticipation, self-correction, even something like intention. The same can be said of ecosystems. Feedback loops regulate populations. Signals propagate through chemical and behavioral channels. Stability emerges from interaction rather than central control. In both cases, awareness, if it exists at all, is diffuse, not located in one place, but spread across relationships. Now extend this line of thinking further. The universe itself is the largest network we know. Matter and energy interacting across space and time. Information flowing through fields, particles, forces, and laws that apply everywhere. No central processor, no privileged node. Just countless interactions, shaping one another continuously. If awareness can emerge in networks without a single center, if it can arise as a property of interaction rather than location, then the idea of a universal awareness becomes difficult to dismiss outright. Not a thinking mind, not a conscious agent with desires, but a distributed sensitivity, a capacity for self-modulation, a way for the universe to register its own state across countless local processes. This idea is deeply uncomfortable because it threatens two cherished assumptions at once. First, it challenges the notion that consciousness is exclusively human or biological. Second, it undermines the idea that meaning exists only inside individual minds. If awareness can be distributed, then the line between my experience and our experience becomes less absolute. The self begins to look less like an isolated island and more like a node in a vast informational sea. This does not erase individuality. It reframes it. An individual mind may be a localized concentration of awareness, intense, coherent, self-referential, but it may not be the only form awareness can take. It may simply be one expression among many, shaped by particular constraints. And this reframing introduces a quiet conflict. If awareness is not strictly individual, then the question, "Who am I?" can no longer be answered solely by pointing inward. Identity becomes relational, contextual, defined as much by connection as by separation. This runs counter to deeply ingrained habits of thought. We are taught to locate the self somewhere inside, behind the eyes, inside the head. But neuroscience has never found such a place. There is no central eye neuron, no command center where experience resides. The sense of self emerges from coordination, not from a core, which mirrors, once again, the structure of the universe itself. No center, no privileged point, only patterns of relation. This parallel is not accidental. If the universe is organized in a way that favors distributed structures, networks, rather than hierarchies, then it is natural that awareness, when it appears, would reflect that organization. This does not mean the universe is conscious in the way we are conscious. That would be a category error. But it does mean that consciousness may be a local intensification of a more general property, the capacity of complex systems to integrate information about themselves. And if that capacity exists at multiple scales, then awareness may not belong to individuals alone. It may belong to processes. This idea shifts the ground beneath us, because if awareness can be collective, then the universe does not merely contain conscious beings. It may contain conscious processes, ways of knowing that are slower, broader, less personal, but no less real. The universe thinking, in this sense, would not look like thought. It would look like lawfulness, like regularity, like feedback, like adaptation across epochs. It would be cognition without a face. This challenges our expectations so thoroughly that the mind instinctively resists it. We want awareness to feel like something, to have a point of view, to experience time in moments rather than eons. But those preferences may be artifacts of our scale. A being that operates across billions of years would not experience urgency. A process distributed across light years would not feel localized sensation. Awareness at that scale would be alien not because it is impossible, but because it is incompatible with our intuitions. And yet, the structure that enables awareness may still be present. This leads to a subtle but profound tension. If awareness can be distributed across systems larger than individuals, and if the universe itself is the largest integrated system of all, then consciousness may not be confined to the interior of human minds. It may also exist as something we participate in rather than possess. This does not diminish the value of individual experience. It deepens it. Because if each mind is a localized expression of a broader informational process, then awareness is not something that begins and ends with us. It is something that flows through us, shaped by our structure, but not owned by it. This reframing dissolves another familiar boundary, the boundary between me and not me. If awareness is relational, then identity is not a fixed object. It is a dynamic pattern, a temporary coherence in a larger field of interaction. And that field extends far beyond the brain. It includes language, culture, memory, technology, environment. It includes the past encoded in structure and the future constrained by possibility. It includes the universe itself, which brings us to a question that feels increasingly difficult to avoid. If awareness is not solely individual, and if the universe supports distributed forms of self-reference, then what kind of awareness is actually emerging when a human mind turns its attention toward the cosmos? Time feels like the most reliable thing we know. It moves forward. It never pauses. It never reverses. It carries everything with it: stars, civilizations, memories, regrets. We measure our lives by it. We fear its passing. We assume it flows the same way everywhere, for everyone, always. And yet, the deeper we examine time, the less solid it becomes. Physics tells us that time is not universal. It stretches, it compresses, it slows near massive objects. It behaves differently depending on motion and gravity. There is no single cosmic clock ticking in the background. Each system carries its own rhythm. This alone should unsettle our intuition. But the strangeness does not stop there. At the most fundamental levels, time may not exist at all, not as we experience it. Some of our deepest physical models describe reality without a preferred direction of time. The equations work just as well forward as backward. The flow we feel so vividly does not appear to be written into the laws themselves, which raises a disturbing question. If time is not fundamental, where does the feeling of time come from? The answer, increasingly, points inward. Time, as we experience it, appears to emerge from change, memory, and anticipation, from systems that can register differences between states and relate those differences to one another. Without memory, there is no past. Without expectation, there is no future. There is only an eternal present with no direction. In other words, time requires a system capable of integration, a system capable of awareness. This means that the arrow of time, the sense that moments move from what was to what will be, may not be a property of the universe itself, but a property of how certain systems experience it. The universe, at its deepest level, may simply be a vast collection of relationships unfolding according to constraint. Time, as felt, arises when those relationships are processed by systems that remember. This reframes something profound. The universe may not exist in time. Time may exist in the universe, locally, wherever memory and change intersect. And memory, once again, brings us back to awareness. Because memory is not passive storage. It is an active reconstruction. Every recollection reshapes what is remembered. Every anticipation colors what is perceived. The present is never neutral. It is thick with traces of what came before and projections of what might come next. This is not how time works in equations. It is how time works in minds, which introduces a quiet but destabilizing conflict. If time, as experienced, arises from awareness, and if awareness itself is a local phenomenon emerging from complex systems, then the universe's deepest temporal structure may not resemble a flowing river at all. It may resemble a landscape, all moments existing as potential relations, with before and after, emerging only where systems trace paths through that landscape. This idea feels abstract, but its implications are intimate. Your sense of past and future may not be a window onto cosmic reality. It may be a strategy, an evolved way for complex systems to navigate change. And yet, this strategy is powerful enough to shape everything we care about. Hope, regret, purpose, meaning, all depend on the asymmetry of time, on the belief that what has happened cannot be undone, and what has not yet happened can still be influenced. If time were merely an illusion, these would collapse. But time is not an illusion. It is an interface, a way reality becomes navigable from the inside. This returns us to the central tension. Space loses its solidity at the smallest scales. If boundaries dissolve into relations, if awareness emerges from recursion, then time too may be something that exists primarily within systems capable of experience. The universe itself may not age, only its patterns do. Stars burn out, galaxies evolve, structures change, but age is something we assign when we track these changes relative to one another. Time becomes meaningful when there is comparison, when one state is held against another. Without comparison, there is no direction, and comparison requires memory, which means that time, like space, may be deeply entangled with perception. Not because the universe depends on us, but because any universe that can be experienced must pass through systems that impose order on change. This suggests a strange inversion. We thought time was the stage on which awareness appears, but it may be the other way around. Awareness may be one of the conditions under which time, as we know it, comes into being. If that is true, then the universe does not unfold toward a future in the way we imagine. It does not move toward an end. It does not age toward completion. It simply exists as a network of relations, with temporal direction emerging wherever systems trace those relations in sequence. Which brings us back to the question of endpoints. If time is not fundamental, and if the universe does not move toward anything, then the idea of a final moment, a last instant, a temporal edge becomes questionable. An ending requires a timeline, but if timelines are local constructions, then the universe as a whole may not possess one. It may not be headed anywhere. It may not be finishing a story. And this realization shifts the meaning of the end of the universe yet again. The end may not be a moment in the future when everything stops. It may be a limit of temporal experience, a point beyond which systems can no longer trace change in a coherent way. A breakdown of sequence, a saturation of memory, a collapse of anticipation. And where would such a limit appear? Not at the edge of space, not at the death of stars, but at the boundary where awareness can no longer integrate change into experience, which makes the next question unavoidable. If time itself is something that emerges within systems capable of memory and awareness, then what happens to time when awareness turns inward, examining its own structure? There comes a moment in every long inquiry when direction quietly dissolves, not because the journey has failed, but because the map we were using no longer applies. Up to now, the universe has appeared as something vast. We move through space, expanding outward, time flowing forward, structures growing more complex as we follow them deeper. Even when boundaries blurred, we still assumed there was a direction, outward or inward, larger or smaller, earlier or later. But something subtle has been happening beneath these assumptions. The universe has been refusing to give us a stable place to stand. Every attempt to locate an absolute reference point has failed. There is no center of expansion, no universal now, no privileged frame from which everything else can be measured without distortion. Motion, position, duration all depend on perspective. This is not a technical inconvenience. It is a structural feature. The universe does not offer a viewpoint from outside itself, which means that every description of it is made from within. This is the turning point, where a quiet realization begins to surface. We are not observers standing before the universe. We are processes occurring inside it. And this distinction changes the nature of every question we have asked so far. When we imagined ourselves as observers, we believed there must be a way, at least in principle, to step back far enough, zoom out wide enough, and see the whole, a final diagram, a complete picture, an answer that closes the loop. But a system cannot step outside itself without ceasing to be the system. There is no external balcony from which the universe can be viewed in full. Any perspective that exists is necessarily embedded, shaped by location, history, structure, and limitation. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a consequence of belonging. And belonging introduces a profound constraint. The system tries to understand itself from within. It encounters paradox, self-reference, loops that never quite close. The description becomes part of the thing being described. This is familiar in mathematics, in logic, in language. Any sufficiently expressive system can generate statements it cannot fully resolve without contradiction or incompleteness. The universe may be no different. If the universe is a self-organizing system capable of generating observers, then those observers are not separate from the system's dynamics. They are among its expressions. Their attempts to understand the whole are constrained by the same rules that govern everything else. This means that the limits we encounter, the inability to find an edge, a center, a final explanation, may not be temporary gaps in knowledge. They may be intrinsic, not because the universe is unknowable, but because it is self-referential. A system looking at itself cannot produce a description that is both complete and detached. This is where conflict sharpens into clarity. We have been asking, where does the universe end? As if the universe were an object with boundaries. But perhaps the more accurate question is, what happens when a system becomes complex enough to ask that question about itself? End quote. Because that moment marks a shift. The universe is no longer just unfolding. It is reflecting. Reflection does not require consciousness in the human sense. It requires feedback, a loop where outputs influence future inputs, where structure begins to encode information about its own state. The universe has been doing this from the beginning. Laws constrain behavior. Behavior reinforces laws. Structures emerge that stabilize certain patterns over others. But when awareness arises, when a system begins to model not just the world, but its own modeling reflection reaches a new depth. At that point, the universe does not merely behave according to rules. It begins to question them, not intentionally, not verbally, but structurally, through minds that ask why. This is where the idea of being inside the universe becomes unavoidable. We are not inside it like objects in a box. We are inside it like thoughts inside a mind, not separate from the process, but generated by it. And this analogy is not poetic exaggeration. It is structurally precise. A thought cannot step outside the mind that thinks it. A perception cannot observe the perceptual system that generates it without becoming part of that observation. The act of turning inward changes what is being examined. The same may be true of cosmology. Every attempt to describe the universe feeds back into the universe through technology, through action, through altered behavior. Knowledge reshapes the system that produces knowledge. This recursive loop ensures that there is no final, frozen description waiting to be discovered. Reality is not a completed manuscript. It is a draft that rewrites itself as it is read. This realization alters the meaning of progress. Progress is no longer movement toward an external endpoint. It is movement within a space of understanding that expands as it is explored. The universe does not lead us to an answer that ends inquiry. It leads us into deeper participation, and participation requires letting go of the fantasy of detachment. This is uncomfortable because detachment promises safety. It allows us to believe we can know without being affected, observe without consequence, understand without responsibility. But embedded systems do not have that luxury. To know is to change. To observe is to interact. To understand is to become part of what is understood. This does not diminish science. It grounds it. It reminds us that knowledge is not something we extract from the universe like ore from rock. It is something that grows within the universe, altering its own conditions of possibility. And once this is acknowledged, a new boundary comes into focus. Not a boundary of space, not a boundary of time, a boundary of self-reference. The point at which understanding loops back on itself so tightly that the distinction between knower and known dissolves. At that point, the universe is no longer something out there to be mapped. It is something happening here through perception, through memory, through inquiry itself. This brings us to a question that marks a true shift in orientation. If we are not observers standing outside the universe, if we are expressions of its own self-organizing processes, then what exactly changes when the universe begins to examine itself through us? Once the distinction between observer and universe begins to dissolve, another boundary quietly follows it. The boundary between inside and outside. For most of human history, this line has felt unquestionable. There is an inner world, private, subjective, inaccessible to others. And there is an outer world objective, shared, existing independently of any single mind. This division feels so natural that we rarely pause to ask where it actually comes from. But when we examine it closely, the boundary starts to blur. Everything you consider outside arrives through channels that are unmistakably internal. Light touches the retina. Sound vibrates tiny bones. Chemical signals bind to receptors. Nowhere does the world step directly into awareness. It is always translated, always mediated, always reconstructed. The brain does not open a window to reality. It builds a model, and that model is what you live inside. This does not mean the external world is fictional. It means the distinction between inner and outer is not as clean as it appears. The world you experience is already an internal event, shaped by neural architecture, memory, expectation, and emotion. What feels like distance is inference. What feels like solidity is interpretation. Even your own body, supposedly the most obvious marker of inside, is known only through sensation. Nerves report pressure, temperature, pain, position. The brain integrates these signals and constructs the feeling of having a body. There is no direct access, only representation, which leads to a subtle but profound realization. The line between inside and outside is not drawn by reality. It is drawn by cognition. It is a useful distinction, essential for survival, but not a fundamental feature of existence. It is a map, not the territory. This becomes especially clear in moments when the boundary wavers. In deep concentration, the world fades and thought fills awareness. In awe, the sense of self shrinks, and the vastness outside seems to pour inward. In dreams, the distinction collapses entirely. Inner images take on the authority of external events. In certain altered states, the feeling of separation dissolves, leaving only experience without a clear owner. These are not anomalies. They are hints. They reveal that the division between inner and outer is flexible, negotiable, context-dependent. It shifts with attention, with emotion, with changes in neural organization. If the boundary can move, then it is not absolute. And if it is not absolute at the level of individual experience, why should we assume it is absolute at the scale of the universe? This is where the conflict deepens. We have been searching for the outside of the universe, as if such a thing must exist, a place beyond space, beyond time, beyond everything we know. But perhaps that impulse mirrors the same cognitive habit that creates the sense of an inner self separate from an outer world. Perhaps the universe has no outside in the same way the mind has no outside. A thought does not exist inside the mind as opposed to outside it. The distinction does not apply. The thought is an activity of the system. Asking where it is located misses the point. The universe may be similar, not a container with an interior and an exterior, but an ongoing process with varying modes of organization. Galaxies, stars, brains, ideas, these are not things inside the universe. They are ways the universe is happening. From this perspective, asking where the universe ends is like asking where a thought ends. Does it end when it fades? When attention shifts? When memory dissolves? Or does it persist as a trace, influencing what comes next? The question loses its footing. This reframing has a quiet but destabilizing consequence. If inside and outside are cognitive distinctions rather than ontological ones, then the feeling of being in the universe may be misleading. We are not contained by it like objects in space. We are expressions of it, and expressions do not stand apart from what expresses them. Dissolves another deeply ingrained assumption that the universe is something we inhabit rather than something we enact. Every measurement, every theory, every image of distant galaxies is not a neutral mirror. It is an interaction between the universe's structure and a system capable of representing that structure. Knowledge is not a photograph taken from outside. It is a pattern formed within. This does not make knowledge arbitrary. It makes it contextual. The universe remains lawful, consistent, constrained, but the way those constraints appear depends on the form of the system encountering them. A bacterium experiences chemical gradients. A human experiences colors and shapes. A telescope extends vision into wavelengths we cannot see. Each reveals a different outside, but all of them occur within the same unfolding process. There is no view from nowhere, which means the idea of an absolute outside, the ultimate vantage point from which the universe can be seen whole, may be a fantasy born from our habit of separating inner and outer worlds. Once that habit loosens, something unexpected happens. The universe stops feeling distant, not smaller, not less mysterious, but closer. The stars are no longer foreign objects scattered across emptiness. They are part of the same process that generates thoughts, emotions, and questions. The atoms in your body were shaped by stellar processes. The laws that govern galaxies govern neurons. The patterns repeat, not because of coincidence, but because there is no fundamental break between scales. The universe is not something you are inside of. It is something you are continuous with. This continuity does not erase individuality. It contextualizes it. A wave is not separate from the ocean, but it is still a wave. It has form, duration, character. When it dissipates, the ocean remains, but the wave was never independent of it. The same may be true of minds, and this realization introduces a quiet unease. If the boundary between inner and outer is not fundamental, if the universe has no true outside, if awareness is a local expression of a broader process, then the question of where the universe ends transforms yet again. The end may not be a place, a time, or even a limit of knowledge. It may be the point where the distinction between observer and world can no longer be maintained, a point where the universe is no longer something that appears to awareness, but something that appears as awareness. And that raises a question that presses uncomfortably close. If the universe does not have an outside, and if what we call inside is already an expression of it, then what exactly are we referring to when we say self? The word self feels solid. It feels like something you can point to, defend, protect, something that begins where your body begins and ends where your thoughts fall silent. We speak of my mind, my experience, my life, as if ownership were obvious, as if the borders were clearly drawn. But when we slow down and look carefully, the self begins to blur in the same way the universe has been blurring all along. Neuroscience has searched relentlessly for the self, a center, a core, a place where experience gathers and decisions originate. But no matter how deeply the brain is examined, no such center appears. There is no single region that contains you. There is no command node where identity resides. Instead, there is coordination, patterns of activity distributed across networks, signals integrating sensation, memory, emotion, prediction. The feeling of being a self arises not from a thing, but from a process, one that is continuously updated, revised, and renegotiated. The self is not discovered. It is assembled, and assemblies are fragile. Change the inputs, and the sense of self shifts. Damage certain pathways, and identity fractures. Alter neurochemistry, and the world feels unfamiliar. Even without injury or illness, the self changes constantly across time. The person you were 10 years ago feels distant. The person you will be in 10 years is already forming. This alone should make us cautious. If the self is not fixed, if it is not localized, if it is not even stable, then what exactly is it? The most unsettling answer is also the simplest. The self is a boundary the mind draws in order to function. The useful fiction, not false, but instrumental. A way to organize experience, assign responsibility, navigate a complex world. Without some sense of self, coherent action would collapse, decision would fragment, memory would scatter. But usefulness does not imply fundamentality. The boundary of the self may be no more absolute than the boundary between inside and outside, or between observer and universe. It may be another cognitive distinction that works well at a certain scale and dissolves when examined too closely. This realization echoes something we have already encountered. The universe, too, appears stable at certain scales and unstable at others. Galaxies hold together for billions of years, yet stars are born and die within them. Atoms feel solid, yet are mostly empty space. Laws feel eternal, yet emerge from deeper symmetries. Stability, it seems, is contextual, and the self may be no exception. This introduces a quiet but profound conflict. We rely on the self to anchor meaning, to answer questions like, who is experiencing this, and why does it matter? But if the self is a process rather than a thing, then meaning itself becomes dynamic, contextual, dependent on ongoing organization rather than fixed identity. This can feel threatening. If there is no solid self, what remains of purpose, of continuity, of responsibility? But notice something important. The absence of a fixed core does not eliminate coherence. A whirlpool has no solid center, yet it persists. A melody has no physical substance, yet it unfolds with structure and intention. A storm has no single location, yet it shapes everything around it. The self may be similar, not a thing that exists independently, but a pattern that holds together long enough to matter. And if that is true, then the self is not something separate from the universe. It is one of the ways the universe temporarily organizes experience. This is not a metaphor. Your body is made of atoms forged in stars. Your thoughts depend on physical laws that govern galaxies. Your memories are encoded in matter, obeying the same constraints as everything else. There is no point at which the universe stops and the self begins. The distinction is functional, not ontological, which means that asking, "Who am I?" may be structurally similar to asking, "Where does the universe end?" End quote. Both questions assume a boundary that may not exist in the way we imagine. Both arise from a desire for closure, but processes do not offer closure. They offer continuity. This reframing alters something subtle but important. If the self is not an isolated unit, but a node in a vast network of relations, then identity is not ownership, it is participation. The self is not something you have, it is something you do. And doing implies change. Every interaction reshapes the pattern. Every experience leaves a trace. Every thought alters the conditions for the next thought. The self is never finished, never complete, never final, which mirrors the universe itself. The universe is not a completed object. It is an unfolding process. Structures arise, persist, dissolve. Patterns repeat across scale. No final state is reached. No ultimate boundary is crossed. If the self is a local expression of that same process, then its instability is not a flaw. It is a feature. This realization softens another long-held assumption. We often imagine death as the end of the self, just as we imagine the end of the universe as a final collapse or freeze. But if the self is a pattern rather than a thing, then its end may be more like a transformation than a termination. Patterns dissolve, components persist, relations reconfigure. This does not promise continuity of experience. It does not offer comfort in the usual sense, but it does suggest that endings may not be as absolute as they feel from within the pattern itself. Which brings us back to the larger question, now reframed through intimacy rather than abstraction. If the self is not a fixed entity, if it is a temporary organization of matter, energy, and information, if it arises from the same recursive principles that shape the universe, then the boundary between personal experience and cosmic structure grows thinner still. The universe is no longer something that contains selves. Selves are something the universe does. That realization presses toward a deeper uncertainty. If the self is a process rather than a thing, And if processes have no clear edges, then where exactly does experience itself begin, and where could it possibly end? Experience feels immediate. It feels like the most undeniable fact there is. You can doubt the stars, doubt theories, doubt even your own memories. But the fact that something is being experienced right now seems impossible to deny. Experience feels like the last solid ground when everything else becomes uncertain. And yet, even here, solidity begins to soften. What exactly is experience? It is tempting to treat it as a thing, something that appears, persists for a moment, then disappears. But when we look closely, experience does not behave like an object. It has no clear edges, no fixed location, no stable duration. It is always in motion, always transitioning, always dissolving into what comes next. Try to isolate a single moment of experience. The attempt itself alters it. The moment you attend to it, it has already changed. Sensation becomes memory. Presence becomes reflection. The now slips into the past faster than it can be grasped. This is not a failure of attention. It is the nature of experience itself. Experience is not a snapshot. It is a flow, a continuous integration of signals, expectations, memories, and predictions. It arises from coordination across systems, not from any single source, which means experience does not begin where we think it does. We assume experience begins inside the brain, inside the self. But the processes that give rise to experience stretch far beyond those boundaries. Sensory input originates in the environment. Meaning is shaped by culture. Language carries histories that predate any individual mind. Even emotion is influenced by hormonal systems interacting with external conditions. Experience is not sealed. It is porous. This challenges a deeply ingrained intuition. We like to imagine experience as something private, contained, owned. But in reality, it is co-produced. The world participates in every experience just as much as the nervous system does. There is no clean handoff point where the external becomes internal. Experience is not received. It is enacted. An enactment requires context. Consider how drastically experience can change without any alteration to the external world. A shift in mood transforms meaning. A change in expectation alters perception. The same sound can be comforting or threatening depending on context. The same silence can feel peaceful or unbearable. What changes is not the world, but the pattern of integration within the system experiencing it. This reveals something crucial. Experience is not anchored to objects. It is anchored to relationships, which brings us back, once again, to the structure of the universe. If reality, at its deepest level, is relational, defined by interactions rather than isolated things, then experience may be one of the most direct expressions of that fact. Experience is what reality looks like when relations are integrated into a coherent perspective. But coherence is not guaranteed. It must be maintained. And maintaining coherence requires boundaries, not rigid walls, but flexible distinctions that allow patterns to hold together long enough to be meaningful. The self provides one such boundary. Time provides another. Attention provides yet another. But none of these boundaries are absolute. They are dynamic, adjustable, context-dependent. They shift as conditions change. This means that experience does not have a single point of origin. It emerges wherever integration occurs. And integration is not confined to the brain alone. Neural activity integrates signals, yes, but those signals originate elsewhere. Social systems integrate meaning across individuals. Technologies integrate memory beyond biological limits. Ecosystems integrate feedback across species. Even physical systems integrate constraints across space and time. Integration is everywhere, which raises a subtle but unsettling possibility. Perhaps experience is not an all-or-nothing phenomenon. Perhaps it exists on a spectrum. At one end, there are simple systems with minimal integration, barely capable of sustaining anything like experience. The other, there are highly integrated systems capable of rich, layered, self-reflective awareness. Human consciousness occupies a narrow region of this spectrum, not the beginning, not the end. If this is true, then experience does not suddenly appear at a single threshold. It accumulates, it deepens, it intensifies as systems become more capable of relating their own states to one another. This reframes the question of where experience begins. It may not begin anywhere in particular. It may fade in and out across scales, becoming more or less coherent, depending on conditions. And if experience does not have a clear beginning, then its ending becomes equally uncertain. When does an experience truly end? When sensation stops? When memory fades? When the system that integrated it dissolves? Or does experience persist as influence, as a trace that reshapes what follows, even after it is no longer present as awareness? Every experience leaves marks on neural pathways, on behavior, on the environment, on other minds. Experience changes the conditions under which future experience arises. In this sense, experience does not simply vanish, it propagates. This propagation is subtle, but profound. It means that experience is not merely something that happens within the universe. It is something that alters the universe, however locally, however temporarily. And this alteration feeds back. The universe changes the conditions of experience, and experience changes the conditions of the universe. This is not symmetry, it is recursion. And recursion has no clear start or finish, which brings us back to the central tension of this entire inquiry. If experience is relational, if it emerges from integration rather than location, if it exists on a spectrum rather than as a binary, then the idea of a final boundary, where experience stops, where awareness ends, becomes increasingly difficult to define. The universe may not contain experience as a special case. Experience may be one of the ways the universe organizes itself when relations become sufficiently dense. And if that is true, then the question we have been circling takes on a new form. If experience does not clearly begin and does not clearly end, then what, exactly, is the universe becoming when it experiences itself at all? At a certain depth, the act of measuring begins to feel strangely circular. We build instruments to observe the universe. Those instruments are designed by minds. Those minds are shaped by brains. Those brains are physical systems governed by the same laws they are attempting to measure. And the data those instruments collect must ultimately be interpreted by the very systems that designed them. The loop is subtle, but it is closed. We often imagine measurement as a neutral bridge between observer and reality, a clean pipeline through which truth flows untouched. But measurement is never that simple. Every tool embodies assumptions. Every metric encodes choices. Every observation highlights some features while ignoring others. To measure is to decide what matters. This is not a flaw in science. It is an unavoidable condition of it. The universe does not present itself raw. It must be framed, filtered, translated into quantities we know how to handle. Length, mass, charge, time. These are not things the universe hands us. They are conceptual handles we impose to grasp patterns that would otherwise overwhelm us. And these handles work remarkably well. They allow us to predict eclipses, land probes on distant worlds, map the distribution of galaxies, but their success hides a deeper truth. Every measurement is also a reduction. When we measure temperature, we discard the motion of individual particles. When we measure position, we ignore internal structure. When we measure time, we collapse countless microchanges into a single parameter. Measurement simplifies reality in order to make it intelligible. And intelligibility has limits. As we push deeper towards smaller scales, larger scales, earlier moments we encounter domains where our handles no longer grip. Space becomes granular. Time loses direction. Cause and effect blur. The very act of measurement begins to influence what is measured. At that point, science does not fail. It reflects. It reveals not only the structure of the universe, but the structure of our ways of knowing it. This is where an uncomfortable conflict emerges. Are we discovering the universe as it is, or are we uncovering the contours of our own cognitive scaffolding? The answer, increasingly, seems to be both. The universe constrains what can be known, but the form knowledge takes is shaped by the systems doing the knowing. Our theories do not float above reality. They are embedded within it, subject to the same limitations and symmetries. This becomes especially apparent when we confront the limits of objectivity. We speak of objectivity as if it meant independence from the observer, but true independence is impossible in an embedded system. What objectivity really means is invariance patterns that remain stable across different perspectives. And invariance does not require detachment. It requires structure. This reframes the role of the observer in a way that is both humbling and empowering. We are not distortions contaminating pure reality. We are constraints through which reality becomes describable. Our measurements do not pull us away from the universe. They bind us more tightly to it. The universe is not something we look at through a window. It is something we interrogate from within. And interrogation leaves traces. Every measurement changes the conditions of future measurements. Every theory shapes the questions we ask next. Every discovery alters behavior, technology, and priorities, feeding back into the system being studied. The universe is not indifferent to being known, not because it resists knowledge, but because knowledge is an activity within it. This activity does not stop at physics. The same recursive pattern appears in psychology, sociology, economics. When systems are studied, they adapt. When predictions are made, behavior changes. When models become widespread, they influence outcomes. The act of knowing becomes part of the phenomenon known. This is not a problem to be solved. It is a condition to be acknowledged, and acknowledging it changes the meaning of truth. End quote. Truth is no longer a static snapshot of reality taken from nowhere. It is a stable relationship between descriptions and the structures they describe, a coherence that persists despite the embeddedness of the observer. This kind of truth is dynamic. It evolves as perspectives widen. It deepens as integration improves. It is not final. Which brings us back to the question of endings. If measurement itself is a recursive act, if the universe measuring the universe through us alters both, then the idea of a final, complete measurement becomes incoherent. There can be no ultimate map that leaves nothing out, because the map would have to include itself. There can be no final theory that closes inquiry, because inquiry reshapes the conditions under which theory operates. The universe cannot be fully captured by a description without remainder, not because it is mysterious in a mystical sense, but because it is self-including. A system that contains its own means of description cannot be exhaustively described without paradox. This does not diminish the power of science. It reveals its depth. Science is not a ladder leading to a final rung. It is a spiral, returning to similar questions at higher levels of integration, each time with greater nuance, broader context, deeper humility. The more we know, the more we realize that knowing itself is part of what is happening. And this realization subtly shifts the question we have been asking all along. We wanted to know where the universe ends. But perhaps a universe that includes its own observers cannot end in the way we imagine. It cannot be finished, because finishing would require stepping outside the very process that generates understanding. The universe may not be something that can be fully measured, not because it is infinite in size, but because it is infinite in reference. It always includes the act of referring, And this inclusion changes the nature of boundaries. The edge of the universe may not be where measurements stop working. It may be where measurement becomes self-aware of its own limits, where knowing turns into questioning, where precision gives way to reflection. And that brings us to a final tension for this stage of the journey. Every attempt to measure the universe is also an expression of the universe measuring itself, and if this recursive loop has no final closure, then what does it mean for understanding itself to be part of the structure we are trying to understand? At some point, understanding stops feeling like accumulation. It no longer feels as though we are gathering pieces of a puzzle that will one day click into place. Instead, it begins to feel like a transformation, something that changes the one who understands as much as what is understood. This shift is subtle, but decisive. Early knowledge expands outward. It adds facts, fills gaps, extends reach, but deeper understanding folds inward. It rearranges assumptions. It alters orientation. It forces a reconsideration of where meaning is located. And when understanding turns inward in this way, it exposes another quiet boundary we have taken for granted. The boundary between knowing about something and being within it. We are comfortable knowing about the universe. Distances, ages, compositions, motions. These feel safely external. We can catalog them without consequence. But when understanding begins to touch the structure of perception, identity, and experience, it no longer remains external. It becomes participatory. To understand the universe at this depth is not merely to describe it differently. It is to inhabit a different relationship with it. This is where a new kind of resistance often arises. Not intellectual resistance, but existential resistance. Because if understanding is participatory, then it carries responsibility. It implies that knowledge is not neutral. That insight alters how we act, what we value, what we ignore. And this threatens a comforting illusion. The illusion that we can know without being changed. But no system embedded within another can do that. Understanding, at its deepest level, is a form of alignment, a tuning between internal models and external constraints. When alignment improves, behavior changes, sometimes subtly, sometimes profoundly. This is why knowledge has consequences, even when we wish it did not. The discovery that the Earth is not the center of the cosmos did not merely change astronomy. It altered humanity's self-image. The realization that time is relative did not merely refine physics. It reshaped our intuitions about simultaneity and causation. Understanding changes the frame, and frames determine meaning. This brings us back to the idea of the universe understanding itself. If observers are expressions of the universe's own dynamics, then understanding is not an external commentary layered onto reality. It is one of the ways reality reorganizes itself in response to its own patterns. Understanding is feedback, and feedback drives evolution. Not biological evolution alone, but conceptual evolution, cultural evolution, technological evolution. Ways of seeing that propagate because they stabilize behavior, improve prediction, or deepen coherence. This is not teleology. It is selection. Ideas that fit the structure of reality persist. Those that do not dissolve. Understanding evolves because it is constrained by the universe it attempts to describe, which means that the universe does not merely permit understanding. It shapes it. And shaped understanding, in turn, reshapes the universe locally, incrementally, but irreversibly. This reciprocal shaping blurs another boundary, the boundary between fact and value. We often pretend these belong to separate domains. Facts describe what is. Values describe what matters. But in an embedded system, facts influence values by constraining possibilities, and values influence facts by guiding action. What we consider important determines what we study. What we study determines what we discover. What we discover alters what we consider important. The loop closes again. This suggests that meaning is not something added to the universe by conscious beings. It is something that emerges whenever systems capable of preference interact with constraints. Meaning is relational. It arises from the intersection of structure and concern is not arbitrary. It is shaped by survival, by coherence, by the need to maintain integration over time. Systems that fail to care about anything dissolve. Systems that care too rigidly fracture. Meaning lives in the balance. Mirrors everything else we have seen. Balance between order and chaos, between stability and change, between separation and unity. The universe seems to favor these balances, not because they are ideal, but because they are sustainable. Understanding, then, is not a quest for final answers. It is a process of attunement. We attune our models to reality. Reality responds through consequence. Models adjust again. Over time, coherence deepens not into certainty, but into fluency. We become better at navigating what exists. This reframing dissolves another expectation. We often imagine that deep understanding will deliver certainty, a firm ground on which doubt no longer intrudes. But embedded understanding does the opposite. It increases sensitivity to context, to limitation, to the provisional nature of every claim. It replaces certainty with trust. Trust in process. Trust in constraint. Trust in the capacity to adapt when models fail. This is not weakness, it is maturity. And maturity changes how we think about endings. A mature process does not rush toward closure. It recognizes that closure often signals rigidity. It leaves space for revision, for reorientation, for continued participation. If the universe is a self-organizing process that includes its own ways of knowing, then it cannot culminate in a final, static understanding. There is no final sentence that ends the book. There is only continued dialogue between structure and interpretation, which means that the end of the universe, if such a thing exists, would not be an explosion or a fade into darkness. It would be the end of participation. The moment when interaction ceases, when feedback stops, when nothing responds to anything else. But a universe without interaction is not a universe we can meaningfully speak about. It would have no structure, no differentiation, no history. In other words, it would not be an ending we could ever experience. This brings the inquiry into an unexpectedly intimate focus. If understanding is participation, if meaning arises from relation, if endings require the cessation of interaction, then the deepest boundary we can encounter is not a cosmic event. It is the limit of our own capacity to engage. And that capacity is not fixed. It expands with curiosity, contracts with fear, deepens with attention, fragments with distraction. The universe does not end at a point in space or time. It ends, if it ends at all, where participation collapses, where systems can no longer respond to one another in coherent ways. Which raises a final question for this phase of the journey. If the universe remains open as long as participation continues, and if understanding itself is a form of participation, then what happens when participation becomes quiet, minimal, almost still? There is a point where participation does not disappear, but softens. Not into silence, but into stillness. Not into absence, but into minimal movement. A state where interaction has not ended, yet no longer announces itself loudly. Where change continues, but at a pace so gentle it feels almost timeless. This is often mistaken for emptiness. But emptiness is not what is happening. In physics, the quietest regions of space are not truly void. They seethe with activity fields fluctuating, particles appearing and dissolving, energy borrowing existence for the briefest moments before returning it. What we call nothing is only nothing relative to our thresholds of detection. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the absence of sound we are prepared to hear. The same may be true of participation. When interaction slows, when feedback becomes subtle, when patterns stabilize rather than transform, we experience it as an ending, as a fade, as a conclusion. But from within the system, something else may be occurring, a transition into a different mode. Consider how a mind behaves at rest. When the body lies still, when attention loosens its grip on objects, when thought drifts without direction, the mind does not shut down, it reorganizes. Background networks become active, memories integrate, patterns consolidate, meaning shifts beneath the surface. What feels like nothing happening is often the most consequential activity of all. This is not merely a property of brains. Complex systems everywhere exhibit similar behavior. Periods of rapid change are followed by periods of consolidation. Growth alternates with stabilization. Noise gives way to coherence. If the universe is a complex system, and everything we have seen suggests that it is, then it too may possess modes of activity that appear from one perspective, like endings. Expansion slows, stars burn out, structures simplify, interactions thin. From within certain frames, this looks like decay, like a universe winding down. But decay is not annihilation. It is redistribution. Energy does not vanish. Information does not disappear. Patterns transform into subtler forms, spreading thinner, slower, quieter, but still present, which means that an apparent ending may be nothing more than a shift below the threshold of participation we are accustomed to. This reframes the idea of cosmic finality. The heat death of the universe, often imagined as a bleak terminus, is described not as destruction, but as equilibrium, a state where differences have evened out so thoroughly that no work can be extracted. No gradients remain to drive dramatic change. But equilibrium is not nothingness. It is balance, a balance so complete that from within certain systems, nothing seems to happen. Yet even equilibrium is not absolute. Fluctuations persist. Probabilities remain. Structure lingers at scales we may not be equipped to perceive. The universe does not switch off. It settles. And settling is not the same as ending. This insight brings us back to participation in a new light. If participation is the ongoing responsiveness between parts of a system, then its most minimal form is not absence, but near symmetry, a state where interactions cancel out rather than amplify, where movement exists but produces no net change. From within such a state, time feels different, without strong gradients, without sharp contrasts. Sequence loses urgency. The distinction between before and after blurs. Change becomes statistical rather than narrative. This is what stillness feels like from the inside. Not a halt, but a smoothing. And this may be the closest thing to an end that a self-organizing universe can approach. Not a final event, but a final quieting. But even here, something remains unresolved. Because stillness itself is a mode of participation. It is what interaction looks like when differences are minimal, when systems are no longer pushing against one another, but resting into constraint, which means that participation never truly stops. It only changes character. This undermines the idea that the universe could ever reach a point where nothing is happening. As long as there is structure, there is relation. As long as there is relation, there is participation. The universe cannot fully disengage from itself, which brings the inquiry back toward the most intimate scale of all. If the universe's quietest state resembles stillness rather than absence, if participation continues even when change feels imperceptible, then the deepest end we can imagine is not cosmic. It is experiential. It is the point at which a system can no longer register difference as meaningful, a collapse, not of existence, but of experience. And experience, as we have seen, depends on integration, memory, contrast, feedback, When these thin beyond a certain point, experience fades, not because the universe has ended, but because the system is no longer able to participate in a way that produces awareness. This suggests a profound inversion. The universe does not end when it becomes quiet. Awareness ends when the universe becomes too uniform to be experienced. From the universe's perspective, nothing special has occurred. From the perspective of experience, everything has, which raises a question that feels both cosmic and deeply personal. If endings are defined not by what exists, but by what can be experienced, and if experience depends on difference, memory, and integration, then what exactly happens to a universe when there is no longer anyone or anything left to notice the difference? Difference is quieter than we think. We imagine it as contrast, light against dark, motion against stillness, sound against silence. But difference does not require drama. It requires only asymmetry, a slight imbalance, a gentle tilt away from perfect sameness. Without difference, nothing can be registered. Signal can stand out. No memory can form. No experience can take shape. This is not a poetic claim. It is a structural one. Every system that experiences anything at all depends on difference. Neurons fire because of gradients in charge. Vision works because of contrast in light. Thought unfolds because one state is not identical to the next. Even time, as we feel it, is built from difference. The difference between what was and what is now. Difference is the raw material of experience, which makes its disappearance deeply significant. If the universe were to approach a state of perfect uniformity, no gradients, no contrasts, no asymmetries, then experience would not end because existence ceased. It would end because there would be nothing left to notice. This reframes the idea of a cosmic ending yet again. The end of experience is not the end of reality. It is the end of differentiation at the scales that support awareness. From the inside, this feels like annihilation. From the outside, if such a perspective were possible, it would look like completion, a smoothing out of distinctions until nothing stands apart enough to matter. But here, a subtle tension emerges. Perfect uniformity is an idealization. In practice, it is unreachable. Even in the quietest imagined future, fluctuations persist, randomness stirs, probabilities ripple, symmetry is approached, but never fully achieved. Absolute sameness is a mathematical fiction, which means difference never truly disappears. It only thins, and thinning difference changes how experience is possible. In rich, high-contrast environments, experience is vivid, layered, urgent. In low-contrast environments, experience becomes diffuse, subtle, almost dreamlike. Meaning stretches, time softens, identity loosens. This is not only a cosmic speculation. It is something minds already know. In moments of deep stillness just before sleep, or in states of profound calm, experience does not vanish. It becomes minimal, gentle, non-specific. The sharp edges of self and world blur. Awareness remains, but without strong content. What disappears is not awareness itself. It is differentiation. The universe, too, may pass through such states, not ending, but easing, not collapsing, but smoothing. And if awareness is an expression of differentiation integrated over time, then awareness may persist in some form, even as structure simplifies, though not as anything we would recognize as thought, memory, or identity. This challenges a deeply human expectation. We tend to equate existence with experience as we know it. If there is no story, no sensation, no self, we assume there is nothing. But that assumption confuses a mode of experience with existence itself. The universe does not owe us familiarity. If awareness is a spectrum, then our kind of awareness, narrative-driven, memory-rich, identity-centered, occupies a narrow band. Outside that band, Other forms may exist that do not register as experience to us, yet still involve integration and responsiveness at scales and tempos far removed from human life, which means the disappearance of human-like experience would not mark a cosmic endpoint. It would mark a shift beyond our interpretive reach. This returns us to the question that has been quietly evolving since the beginning. If the universe does not end in a place, if it does not end in a moment, if it does not end even in stillness, then what do we mean when we speak of an ending at all? Perhaps endings are not features of reality. Perhaps they are features of experience. Away systems mark the limits of their own participation. When a pattern can no longer sustain integration, it dissolves. From within that pattern, the dissolution feels final. From the outside, it is simply transformation. This suggests that the universe does not have an ending in the way stories do. Stories end because attention moves on. But the universe is not a story told from a single point of view. It is a field of interactions with countless local narratives, each beginning and ending according to the constraints of the systems that sustain them. Stars end. Species end. Civilizations end. Selves end. But the field persists. And persistence does not require continuity of experience, only continuity of relation, which leads us to a delicate realization. The most fundamental boundary we encounter may not be between existence and non-existence. It may be between participation and non-participation, between patterns that integrate difference into experience and patterns that allow difference to dissipate without trace. This boundary is not fixed. It shifts with structure. As long as there are systems capable of holding difference together long enough to matter, experience continues somewhere, somehow. And as long as experience continues, the universe is not finished, which makes the final tension unavoidable. If the universe never truly ends, if only particular modes of experience do, then what exactly are we sensing when we feel that something must eventually be over? The feeling that something must eventually be over does not come from the universe. It comes from us, from the way experience is shaped by finitude, from the way memory accumulates and then breaks, from the way attention narrows, tires, and finally releases its grip. Endings feel inevitable because every experience we know is bounded by energy, by time, by structure. We learn what an ending is long before we can name it. Sleep arrives, hunger returns, a sound fades, a face disappears from view. Even as children, we sense that things do not persist indefinitely in the form we encounter them. Patterns hold for a while, then dissolve. And because our own lives are patterns of this kind, we project that logic outward. We assume the universe must behave the same way. But this assumption hides a subtle error. We confuse the limits of a pattern with the limits of the field in which patterns arise. A wave breaks, but the ocean does not end. A thought passes, but awareness does not vanish. A star dies, but the cosmos does not conclude. Endings belong to configurations, not to the totality that allows configurations to exist. This distinction is easy to miss because we experience reality almost entirely through configurations, through forms that appear, persist, and disappear. We rarely encounter the underlying field directly. When we do, it feels empty, vague, or unsettling, because it lacks the contrasts that give experience its usual texture. This is why the idea of an eternal universe feels strange. Not because eternity is impossible, but because our mode of experience is not built to inhabit it. Experience, as we know it, requires change. Change requires difference. Difference requires limits, and limits imply endings. The narrative structure of consciousness depends on closure. Without closure, experience loses shape. This does not mean the universe must close. It means that the kinds of experience we are familiar with cannot remain open indefinitely. So when we imagine the end of the universe, what we may actually be imagining is the end of our way of participating in it, the end of narrative, the end of memory-driven identity, the end of contrast-rich awareness. We translate this into cosmic terms because we lack another language for it. But the universe may not share our need for narrative resolution. The universe does not tell stories. It generates conditions, and conditions do not conclude. They transition. This realization reframes the anxiety beneath the question of cosmic endings. We are not afraid that the universe will stop. We are afraid that meaning will, that there will come a state in which nothing stands out enough to matter, no difference sharp enough to hold attention, no integration strong enough to produce experience as we know it. In other words, we fear the end of significance. But significance is not a property of the universe in isolation. It is a property of interaction between systems and their constraints. Meaning arises when something affects something else in a way that can be registered, when a difference makes a difference. As long as such interactions exist, meaning exist somewhere, even if not in forms we recognize. This is where the inquiry becomes quietly unsettling, because it suggests that the universe does not guarantee meaning. Meaning is conditional. It depends on structure, on integration, on the persistence of difference. And these are not eternal. They wax and wane. They cluster and disperse. They arise in pockets and fade elsewhere. Meaning is local, which means that our sense of an ending may be an accurate intuition, but misapplied in scale. May indeed be an end, not of the universe, but of this phase of meaning, this mode of awareness, this way of being, a system that cares. And caring is not trivial. It requires vulnerability, exposure to change, sensitivity to difference. Systems that care can be damaged. They can be overwhelmed. They can lose coherence. In a universe tending toward equilibrium, caring becomes harder to sustain. Not impossible, but rarer. And rarity feels like finality when you are inside it. This does not make the universe hostile or indifferent. It makes it vast beyond the demands of any single mode of experience, which returns us to a quiet inversion. Perhaps the deepest truth is not that the universe ends inside us, but that our endings are how the universe experiences transition, through finite systems that arise, integrate, care, and dissolve, through minds that briefly hold meaning before releasing it back into the field, through awareness that flares, fades, and leaves traces that shape what comes next. If that is true, then the sense of ending we feel is not an error, it is information. It tells us where our participation thins, where our mode of integration reaches its limit, and recognizing that limit does not close the inquiry. It opens it into humility, because if our endings are local, and the universe continues through countless other configurations, then the question is no longer how everything ends. The question becomes quieter and more precise. When one way of experiencing reality reaches its limit, what other ways might still remain? When one way of experiencing reality reaches its limit, nothing announces the transition. There is no signal, no cosmic marker, no clear moment when one mode ends and another begins. From the inside, it feels like loss. From the outside, if such a perspective were possible, it would look like reconfiguration. This is the quietest truth of complex systems. They do not collapse into nothing. They rearrange into something else. Every ending we know follows this pattern. A language fades, but its grammar leaves traces in the tongues that replace it. A species disappears, but its genes echo through descendants and ecosystems. A civilization falls, but its ideas resurface in altered forms. Even a thought, once gone, reshapes the mental landscape it passed through. Nothing vanishes without consequence, and consequence is a form of continuity. This is not optimism, it is structure. The universe conserves relations more stubbornly than it conserves forms. Forms are temporary, relations persist. If experience is a form, an organized way of integrating difference, then its disappearance does not imply the disappearance of what made it possible. The conditions that allowed awareness to arise do not evaporate when awareness thins. They remain embedded in matter, in law, in probability, which suggests that when one mode of awareness fades, another may emerge elsewhere, not necessarily richer, not necessarily familiar, but shaped by the same deep constraints. This reframes the idea of return. We often imagine return as repetition, the same patterns appearing again. But in complex systems, return is never exact. It is rhymed, not repeated. The structure reappears, but altered by history. The conditions are similar, but not identical. If awareness is a structural possibility rather than a guaranteed outcome, then it may recur wherever conditions align, across time, across scale, across forms we cannot anticipate. Not eternal consciousness, intermittent knowing. The universe does not stay awake. It wakes and sleeps through its configurations. This does not imply a cosmic cycle with fixed stages. It implies responsiveness, a system sensitive to constraint, reorganizing when gradients allow, settling when they do not. And in this view, the role of human awareness becomes clearer and quieter. We are not the universe's destination. We are one of its experiments. Not an experiment conducted by intention, but by possibility. A configuration that happened to integrate matter, energy, and information in a way that produced experience rich enough to ask about its own limits. That alone is remarkable, but it does not grant permanence. No configuration earns eternity by being aware of itself. And yet, awareness is not wasted, because every instance of it alters the field. The universe is not a blank slate, from one configuration to the next. History accumulates. Structures bias what comes after. The past constrains the future, not deterministically, but directionally. Awareness, even when it fades, leaves directional traces. It changes chemistry. It changes environment. It changes probability. A universe that has hosted minds is not the same universe that has not, which means that awareness, however temporary, participates in shaping what kinds of awareness are possible later. This is not progress. It is lineage. The universe does not move toward a goal. It accrues history, and history matters. This brings us back to the sense of return that has been hovering at the edges of this inquiry. Not a return to beginnings, a return to condition. When awareness fades in one region, it does not signal the end of awareness everywhere. It signals a redistribution of possibility, a thinning here, a thickening elsewhere, perhaps far away in space, perhaps far away in time, perhaps at scales we cannot imagine. The universe does not mourn these transitions. It accommodates them. But from the inside, transitions always feel like loss, because patterns that held meaning are dissolving, because integration is loosening, because what was once coherent is becoming diffuse. This is where fear arises, not cosmic fear, but existential fear. The fear that nothing will replace what is fading. But the universe has never replaced forms directly. It replaces conditions, and conditions, once set, allow new forms to arise not as copies, but as continuations in a deeper sense, which suggests something both humbling and quietly stabilizing. The universe does not depend on any single way of knowing itself, but it does not forget having known itself either. Every instance of awareness becomes part of the universe's memory, not as experience, but as constraint, as altered structure, as changed initial conditions for whatever comes next. This means that even if all familiar forms of experience were to fade, the universe would not revert to ignorance. It would carry forward the imprint of having once been experienced. This is not consciousness surviving. It is significance persisting, which leads us to the final quiet turn. If the universe does not end, if awareness arises and fades as conditions allow, If meaning is local, temporary, but never entirely erased, then perhaps the deepest question is not about cosmic fate. Perhaps it is about stance. How does a finite system relate to an open-ended universe? How does a temporary configuration hold meaning without demanding permanence? How does awareness participate fully while knowing it will not last? The universe does not answer these questions. It embodies them, and embodiment does not conclude. It drifts, which leaves us at the threshold of the final stillness. Not an ending, a release. And one last question, suspended rather than resolved. If the universe does not culminate in a final moment, and if awareness is one of its passing forms, then what remains? When we stop insisting that something must finally be complete, what remains is not an answer. It is a posture. When we stop insisting that something must finally be complete, the universe does not rush to fill the silence. It does not reveal a hidden conclusion or resolve itself into a final shape. Instead, something quieter happens. Expectation loosens. The need for closure softens. The demand that existence justify itself with an ending begins to fade. And in that fading, a different relationship with reality becomes possible. Completion is a human hunger. We crave it because our experiences are finite. Our energy wanes. Our attention fractures. Our stories require an ending so they can be held, remembered, and released. A story without an ending feels unfinished, not because it lacks truth, but because it exceeds the limits of the listener. The universe exceeds us in the same way, not because it is hostile or indifferent, but because it is not a story told from a single point of view. It is a field of unfolding relations, continuously reconfiguring, never pausing long enough to be framed as whole. When we demand completion from such a field, we are asking it to become something it is not. And when we release that demand, something subtle but profound shifts. The universe no longer appears as a question that must be answered. It appears as a process that can be accompanied. This is not resignation, it is alignment. Alignment with a reality that does not culminate, but continues. Not toward a goal, but through variation. Not toward meaning as an object, but through meaning as an activity. When awareness releases its grip on finality, it does not disappear. It becomes lighter, more responsive, less defensive, more capable of participating without trying to own the outcome. This may be the deepest transformation this inquiry has been circling all along. Not a new theory of the universe, a new way of standing within it. If the universe does not end, then our role is not to reach its conclusion. Our role is to engage responsibly with the slice of it we inhabit, to hold difference while it lasts, to integrate meaning while it is possible, to care without demanding permanence. This reframes finitude itself. Finitude is no longer a flaw to be overcome. It is the condition that makes experience possible at all. Only systems that end can care. Only patterns that dissolve can matter. Only temporary integrations can feel urgency, beauty, loss, and love. If everything were permanent, nothing would stand out. If nothing stood out, nothing would be experienced. In this sense, the universe does not betray awareness by letting it fade. It makes awareness possible by allowing it to be finite. And this finitude does not isolate us from the universe. It connects us to it because the same principle applies everywhere. Stars shine because they burn out. Structures exist because they are not eternal. Meaning arises because it can be lost. The universe does not oppose endings. It uses them, which means that when we ask whether the endpoint of the universe lies within us, the question turns out to be both less dramatic and more intimate than we expected. The universe does not end inside us as a location. It passes through us as a phase, a way of organizing itself briefly into reflection, care, and question. We are not the container of the universe's final boundary. We are one of the places where the universe pauses long enough to wonder what it is doing. And wondering, by its nature, does not seek an ending. It seeks openness. This does not dissolve mystery. It deepens it. Because mystery is no longer a problem to be solved, but a condition to be lived within. The universe is not unfinished because it lacks an ending. It is unfinished because finishing is not what it does. It unfolds. It differentiates. It integrates. It releases. Again and again, across scales we can barely imagine. And within that unfolding, awareness appears not as a ruler of reality, not as its goal, but as one of its gestures. A brief inward curve, a moment where the universe bends back on itself and feels what it is like to exist at all. Then the curve relaxes. The gesture passes. The universe continues, not diminished, not completed, simply altered by having once held that form. If there is peace to be found here, it is not in answers. It is in participation without demand, in letting the universe be vast without needing it to conclude, in letting awareness be precious without needing it to last. So when the question returns quietly, inevitably, if the endpoint of the universe is not out there, but within us, it no longer asks for resolution. It asks for attention, and perhaps that is enough. Close your eyes now, if you wish. The universe is still turning, and somewhere within it, difference is still being noticed.